I'm going to, if I may, start by reading from a book I was reading the other day, which is actually the history of black people in England and Wales during the period of the British slave trade, Untold Histories by Cathy Chater. And it's an extract from that. And she's looking at court records for the Old Bailey in the 1760s. And she writes, in 1764, John Morgan from Bengal was robbed of various possessions by the family with whom he was lodging, and he took them to court. The trial was delayed while the judges considered whether he could be sworn on the Al-Quran. They agreed unanimously that he could, but checked what this meant to him. And this is a direct quotation from the court records. John Morgan, I am a Mohammedan. Question, in what manner are people of your profession sworn? Morgan, I touch the book, the Al-Quran, with one hand and put the other hand to my forehead. Then I look upon it, I am bound to speak the truth. And the Old Bailey allowed him to sign on the Quran. Now, I think that little tiny nugget of information immediately opens, doesn't it, all kinds of questions, and perhaps surprising ones, about English courts, British courts in the 1760s. And as far as this writer is concerned, it appears to be something not very special or surprising that this person who was a victim of a crime was allowed to swear on his holy book. And so I'm going to suggest a few reasons why I think that the study, for example, of the history of British Muslims is important and powerful for all of us. These arguments would apply to the history of all our diverse communities. And I've been helped in thinking about this by the work we did from my old school, George Mitchell in Leighton, when we worked with Everyday Muslim. The pictures there are actually two pictures of a workshop at the Bishopsgate that Everyday Muslim did with our Year 10 students. Around there are various images which relate to experiences of British Muslims through the ages. I'd be quite happy if people don't recognise any of them to explain them just at the end of the brief talk. But these are the things that I would suggest are reasons why this is important. And as I do that, I'm also going to raise what I think have been some of the opportunities and the problems with a similar question that started many years ago that led to the Black History Months that we're all aware of with relation to the African Caribbean communities in Britain. Okay, these are reasons why I think I would suggest it's really important for a British Muslim story to be strongly present in the history curriculum. Firstly, so that all young people know and are aware of a knowledge of the long present. And it is a long present. In terms of contact and communication, it certainly goes back at least until the 9th century when King Offa of Mercia was printing coins that did a not very good representation of Arabic, but were reflecting his connection with the merchants coming from North Africa. Or to the 13th century skeleton found outside Ipswich of a North African Muslim who may have been brought back from North Africa. We don't know his exact story, but he's one of several Africans that were found buried in Ipswich. The second reason is an understanding of the cultural influence of Islam throughout our history. And that cultural influence has been highlighted just this week on Radio 4 with they've got a Book of the Week, which is the latest book that's come out about the influence of relationships with the Islamic world of Elizabethan England. But that relationship goes right back to the thinkers before the Norman conquest and earlier, and of course right up to the present day. The cultural influence and importance of Islam, scientific, artistic, philosophical and so on. The third reason is an appreciation, as important for Muslim students as non-Muslim students, of the variety and complexity within British Islamic experience. And that's something that Munira touched on, well, didn't touch on, Munira said very, very strongly when she was speaking to us. that variety and complexity is hugely important. And it's kind of reflected here, isn't it, with these 1930s three young women who are of mixed Yemeni and Geordie heritage and are Muslims living in South Shields at that time. The fourth reason is a recognition that for all of us to have of the importance of an oral family and community history, that our own histories matter. And they tell us about us now, but also about where we're coming from. And the final reason is an awareness that we have of the continued diversity of British history, that we all need to understand, so that we don't end up with a narrow sense of what it means to be British, or a narrow sense, I would suggest, of what it means to be Muslim British. And so how do we do that? Well, I would argue that while the example of Black History Month shows a strength in that Black History Month is a presence in people's minds, it also shows a problem. And there are huge problems. One of the problems is the narrowing out to a particular moment. The second is most Black History Month doesn't seem to focus on British Black history at all. A lot of it seems to focus on either culture or the United States. And really what I think we have to try to achieve is something where the presence of British Muslim history is there inside the story whenever it's there, which means always, and keeps being simply part of the story alongside all the other stories that our young people encounter. Now that means that we have to actually find and discover and share those histories. Another way to do that, and is something where we can, I think, there is a lesson to be learned from a lot of the pressure that was put, particularly by African Caribbean parents over the last 20 or 30 years, where they strongly pushed the importance of their own history with their children, and they pushed the importance of their own history onto schools and onto institutions and organisations. And a lot of the pressure came actually from families that forced people like us in the schools to take notice of parents who said, we want our history to be taught. Now, whether we did it is another question, but they wanted it. The third point in terms of how to is that it seems to me that what we have to try to achieve also is not a wishful thinking history, but an honest history. An honest history of all of us has to be one which incorporates the positive and the negative, the easy and the difficult. And I'll sort of finish, if I may, with a couple of stories that perhaps reflect that. You know, here's Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. Many of you may know his story. And Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, he grows up in West Africa, in the area which is now Senegambia, from a family, and he himself is from a family of slave traders. And he's Muslim, and he's kidnapped, he's captured, and he's taken and he's enslaved, and he's taken to Virginia, where he works on a tobacco plantation. And then he ends up being found by a pastor who realizes that he's extremely able to read and write in Arabic, and he's extremely educated. And he's eventually brought back, and his freedom is bought, and he's brought back via the Royal African Company, ends up in London, and because of his knowledge of Arabic, advises the people who set up the British Museum in their Arabic texts. And he becomes the main advisor for the setting up of the British Museum at that time with Sir Hans Sloane. And eventually goes back to West Africa. Actually, he finds out that his own area of West Africa is in confusion and civil war when he returns. His own life is complex. He goes back to slave trading. He's probably not the most admirable person in the world, but his story is fascinating. And the final one that I'll finish with, which I think is very, very interesting. I was reading it in Caroline Adams' wonderful book, Across 7 Seas and 13 Rivers, and it's Hajj Shirajul Islam. And Hajj Shirajul Islam, he comes from Bengal, he works on the ships as a young man. He ends up in the Second World War as a merchant seaman undergoing torpedoing. He also works as a waiter, he works in a lodging house, he has all sorts of things he does, and he marries a woman from Durham. And he has this beautiful moment in the book where he talks about the moment, some of you will know it, when he decides to go back to Sylhet in Bangladesh, and he's on a visit, and his wife says, I'll come with you, and he says, you better not come with me, you won't be able to deal with it, there isn't any electricity, life is difficult there. She says, well, there are thousands of Bengali women who can live there, well, if they can live there, I can. And she goes back, and it's a wonderful success. and she gets on brilliantly and relates really well to people and engages with them. And then they come back, and eventually she dies, and he decides that now that she's died, he has no reason to stay here, and he actually goes back to Bangladesh and he marries again, because his reason for staying becomes about his relationship with his wife from Durham. And that beautiful, fascinating, exciting, different, complex story, it seems to me, is both an opening for non-Muslim children to a world that actually connects with some of their own stories. Second World War, service industries, relationships, marriage, mixed relationships and so on, but also is I know from working with students, is an opening also for many Bengali children who don't know that story either, because their idea of their own history is actually much narrower than the reality. So why do we do this? Because for all of us, it opens up a truth without which we don't know our own stories.